The air inside the Ravencrest Grand Council chamber is thick with the scent of old parchment, burning beeswax, and the underlying tension of half a dozen rival alphas. A low, persistent murmur echoes off the high stone walls as senior warriors and seasoned pack delegates from 5 different territories lean over a massive oak table, their faces hardened by months of fruitlessness. A territorial trade dispute has been draining the vitality and resources of 2 major allied packs for 4 long months. These are men who have carved their names into history with the weight of their broadswords. Yet they have spent hours circling the same bitter arguments, fully prepared to storm out of the chamber today without a resolution. In the absolute center of this volatile room stands Nyx. She does not hide herself in the shadows of the vaulted columns. She does not stand patiently at the periphery with her documents, waiting for a powerful man to grant her permission to speak. Despite the milky, unseeing stillness of her eyes, the mark of her blindness, she commands the room entirely. She does not raise her voice, yet the moment she begins to speak, the chaotic murmurs die down instantly. For less than 3 minutes, Nyx outlines a perfect, flawless compromise. Her voice is a calm, unwavering cadence that slices through the dense tension like a honed blade. She references a legal and economic precedent she carefully drafted herself 2 full seasons ago, long before anyone else in the chamber even grasped the true structural shape of the crisis. Her reasoning is immaculate, completely devoid of emotional clutter. When she finishes speaking, the long-standing dispute is simply over. The battle-hardened delegates who had been aggressively defending their borders look down at their papers, their expressions a mix of quiet embarrassment and profound awe. Nyx did not seek to humiliate them. She merely presented a solution so elegant and undeniable that it made their months of bickering look foolish. The silence that follows is heavy and absolute. At the head of the long table, Alpha King Zirian of Ravencrest sits with his powerful arms folded across his leather-clad chest. To the rest of the room, his stoic, chiseled face is a mask of unreadable authority. But to those who know how to read the subtle shift in his jaw and the deadly, focused quality of his stillness, it is clear he isn't just listening. Zirian is confirming a profound suspicion he has harbored for a long, long time. His dark, observant eyes remain locked on Nyx, refusing to look away for the remainder of the summit. This is Nyx. This is who she has always been. But before this chronicle unfolds any further, a critical truth must be understood. This is not a tragic tale of a broken woman who withered away in neglect. This is not a story about a discarded mate weeping outside a locked iron gate, praying for a cruel prince to notice her worth and offer a hollow apology. It is not even a narrative fueled purely by a thirst for vengeance. Though the catastrophic ruin that awaits those who crossed her will be nothing short of breathtaking to witness. This is the definitive chronicle of what occurs when an extraordinary, divinely gifted woman finally stops pouring her genius into hands that were never worthy of holding it. It is the story of the magnificent, unyielding power she reclaims once she refuses to shrink herself to accommodate the fragile, the arrogant ego of a lesser man. To understand how she arrived at the center of Zarian's council chamber, we must step backward into the past. We must walk back through the cold betrayal, the agonizing disrespect, and the sacred. A moonlit night when she stood before her entire pack during their grandest ceremony, silently unclasped the silver cuff from her wrist, placed it upon the frozen stone, and walked away into the dark without a single word. Remember this image of Nyx, standing radiant and composed at the heart of power, completely at home in her own authority. This is not a persona she adopted after surviving her trauma. This is the divine essence she always possessed. The universe was simply forcing her to find a kingdom that actually deserved her. The sky over the Blood Moon Royal Pack Palace at dawn is the color of cold, unforgiving iron. Long before the first patrol guards change their shifts on the outer ramparts, Nyx is already seated at her heavy wooden desk. The candles illuminating her workspace have already burned down to half their length, casting flickering shadows across dozens of intricately detailed documents. To her left lies the complex patrol rosters. To her right is a massive supply ledger whose contents she has entirely memorized. And directly in front of her sits a comprehensive 30-page trade resolution. She has spent the last 3 sleepless nights meticulously refining every clause of this treaty. If executed properly, this document will rewrite and secure the Blood Moon Pack's Eastern trade alliances for the next 10 years. And within a few hours, it will be presented to the High Council under someone else's name. Nyx calmly closes the ledger, pausing for a brief second before opening it again. The blatant theft of her intellectual labor no longer stings the way it used to. Over the years, she has mastered the art of looking completely unaffected, burying her personal feelings beneath an armor of absolute competence. An hour later, she navigates the frost-covered stone corridors of the palace courtyard. Even without sight, she moves with an innate grace and the absolute certainty of someone who intimately knows every inch of this territory. She has never needed to announce her presence. Her quiet authority speaks for itself. Passing warriors lower their heads in deep respect, calling out her name. A young mother soothing a crying, restless infant waves from across the lawn. Nyx pauses, lifting 2 fingers in an elegant acknowledgement. She already knows the infant's name, the mother's sleepless anxieties, and the exact herbal remedy needed to break the child's fever. She makes a mental note to have the tincture delivered to their quarters before midday without ever being asked. As she nears the heavy archway of the training corridor, hurried, breathless footsteps catch up to her. It is Zanira, a sharp-eyed 20-year-old patrol officer who is visibly stressed. She holds a crumpled parchment containing the pack's border rotation schedules, a roster that has been systematically flawed and lopsided for the past 2 weeks. I cannot find the vulnerability in the line. My Luna, Zanira says quickly, her voice laced with frustration as she thrusts the parchment toward Nyx. I have redone these calculations 4 times, and the numbers still leave our western flank exposed. Nyx takes the parchment without breaking her smooth stride. She glides her fingertips lightly over the ink, feeling the indentations of the writing for exactly 11 seconds. Then she taps a specific section of the page and hands it back to the young warrior. The structural gap lies entirely between the second and third rotations, Nyx explains calmly. Shift the evening patrol 1 hour forward. The vulnerability closes itself. Zanira stares at the corrected document in absolute awe. How do you always see what the rest of us miss? But Nyx is already moving forward. She has 17 other critical administrative tasks to finalize before the High Council bell tolls. Near the entrance of the records hall, she crosses paths with Valor, the young palace scribe. He is a naturally nervous, awkward clerical worker, but today, an unusually heavy burden seems to weigh down his face, far beyond the physical weight of the massive ledgers stacked in his trembling arms. He hands her a misfiled border report, with his eyes darting frantically toward the floor, offering an apology so breathless and intense that it transcends a normal clerical mistake. Nyx immediately notices the erratic tremor in his voice and the sheer panic radiating from his scent. She doesn't yet know what dark hand is forcing his compliance, but she notes it carefully. She corrects the administrative error on the spot, hands the ledger back to him without a single judgmental comment, and continues on her path. As she passes beneath the tall, arched window that directly overlooks Prince Kaelin's private tower, her footsteps slow against her own volition. The heavy velvet curtains of his chamber are tightly drawn. They have remained closed for most mornings now, spanning more months than she cares to count. The morning strategy review, the vital first hour of the Blood Moon Pack's leadership day, where incoming patrol reports are analyzed and acted upon, has quietly and completely become Nyx's sole responsibility. There was never a formal declaration of this shift. There was no grand council meeting where Kaelin officially handed her the reins. He simply stopped showing up to the early briefings, choosing instead to sleep late or indulge in distractions. Because the reports kept piling up and the safety of the pack was at stake, Nyx simply started opening them herself. The pack adapted flawlessly. No borders collapsed, no supply lines failed. She personally ensured that the kingdom ran perfectly in his absence. Standing beneath his window, a familiar hollow ache radiates deep within her chest. It is the phantom pain of a severed bond, a profound sorrow she has long since stopped naming. Shaking off the brief moment of vulnerability, she adjusts her cloak and walks directly into the High Council chamber. The grand meeting opens with the tedious grain supply dispute that Nyx had already solved in her mind before breakfast. Two high-ranking, boastful warrior captains have been talking in circles for an entire week, screaming over grain allocations. Nyx listens to their posturing for less than 30 seconds before speaking two concise, devastatingly precise sentences. She points out a misfiled distribution record from the previous quarter, instantly exposing the root cause of the imbalance. The aggressive argument collapses under the weight of her logic. Seated at the far end of the long council table, Elder Kyrox catches her eye. The wise, silver-haired elder, whose hair falls elegantly past his shoulders, watches her with the profound expression of a man who has witnessed this dynamic play out for years and has grown deeply disturbed by it. He offers her a slow, sincere nod of his head, a silent message that clearly says, "I see your genius. I always see it." Nyx offers him a nearly imperceptible nod in return, then smoothly shifts her focus back to her documents. At the absolute head of the table sits Prince Kaelin. He is striking and undeniably powerful, possessing the kind of overwhelming, predatory alpha presence that demands submission without effort. He fills the room with his arrogance, a proud leader whose very posture oozes dominance. Kaelin casually picks up the comprehensive 30-page trade resolution that Nyx spent 3 days writing. He clears his throat and presents her intricate architectural framework in 3 brief, simplified sentences, delivering the brilliant ideas as if they had just spontaneously manifested in his own mind. The council elders nod in rapt agreement, murmuring praises for their brilliant prince, and the meeting moves seamlessly forward. From 30 feet away, Nyx sits in perfect silence, watching her life's work presented as another man's genius. She feels a deep, cold numbness wash over her, a sensation she has become terrifyingly skilled at compartmentalizing. When the council dismisses, Nyx walks down the long stone corridor toward her administrative office. Before she can even turn the corner, she hears Serenay. It is not just the sound of Serenay's melodic, practiced voice that warns her, but rather the palpable shift in the atmosphere itself. The very air around Kaelin always seems to distort whenever Serenay is near. The scheming, beautiful, high-ranking woman is already positioned dangerously close to Kaelin's shoulder outside the chamber doors. Far enough to look like a casual coincidence to an outsider, but close enough to be intensely deliberate. Serene possesses a practiced, radiant warmth that is terrifyingly easy to trust. She exudes a calculated gentleness and focused adoration that makes powerful, arrogant men feel uniquely chosen and worshipped. Kaelin is currently smiling down at her, completely captivated by whatever amusing comment she just made. He hasn't pulled away from her. In fact, he hasn't been pulling away from her for months. Serene's sharp eyes instantly spot Nyx over Kaelin's broad shoulder. Her beautiful smile widens immediately, turning bright, generous, and perfectly timed for an audience. "Oh, Nyx, you work so incredibly hard," Serenay says, her voice dripping with artificial sweet admiration. "I honestly do not know how you manage to carry the entire administrative burden of this palace all by yourself." Behind the dripping sweetness of her voice, the center of Serene's eyes are perfectly still, cold, and calculated. "Practice," Nyx replies pleasantly, her tones smooth and entirely devoid of malice. She walks past them without another word and closes herself inside her quiet office. Sitting at her desk, the silence of the room offers no comfort. Her mind drifts back to the corridor. She analyzes where Serenay had been standing. She hadn't just arrived. She was already waiting there, perfectly positioned before the council doors had even opened. She had been lurking the entire time. Nyx opens her ledger and forces herself to keep working. But the thought of Serene's calculated invasion sits in the corner of her mind like a small, frozen stone that refuses to melt. In the center of the Blood Moon inner courtyard lies a grand stone basin, ringed by rare moonflowers that bloom a brilliant silver white in the heat of summer and remain dark, tightly wound buds throughout the winter frost. Nyx has walked past that basin every single morning for 5 years. She was only 19 years old the first time she stood beside it. It was the night immediately following the annual Blood Moon ceremony, the pack's most sacred. A spiritual night where fires are lit to honor the primal bonds of the moon goddess that hold their society together. Back then, Nyx had been standing near the shadows of the Great Hall, quietly ensuring the elders' order. The seating arrangements were flawless, so everyone else could celebrate without distraction. When she happened to look up, Prince Kaelin was staring at her from across the roaring firelit hall. In that exact fraction of a second, the entire world fell completely silent. A true fated mate pull is a cosmic force that defies human or wolf language. It is not mere physical attraction, though the desire is overwhelming. It is an ancient, soul-deep recognition, the sudden, undeniable awareness of a spirit that your own soul has known and loved across 1,000 past lifetimes. It does not arrive as a passing want. It crashes into you as a final, permanent arrival. The divine bond had struck them both at the exact same moment. Nyx had seen the pure, unguarded shock bloom across Kaylin's arrogant face before she could even process her own gasping breath. It was a moment of absolute, vulnerable honesty, the most genuine expression she had ever seen from him. He didn't expect to be paired with a blind Omega either, she remembered thinking that night. That means the goddess's choice is real. She hadn't been wrong about the reality of the bond at its inception. Those early days were luminous, filled with a rare warmth that only a few lucky souls ever experience in a lifetime. Kaylin used to actively seek her out before the morning sun rose, demanding her counsel, not because she was a useful asset, but because he genuinely craved her intellect. There were countless winter evenings where he would find her in the dim library, sitting silently across from her for hours while she worked. Neither spoke, completely content in a shared silence that felt far deeper than any spoken conversation. Every single morning, before the chaos of the kingdom began, Kaylin would wrap his powerful hands around hers and softly ask, "What does the day need, my mate?" That single question. She still carries the echoing memory of it buried deep within a chamber of her heart that she no longer knows how to access. The erosion of their bond did not happen in a single catastrophic explosion. It happened in 100 microscopic, unnoticed moments. Like water grinding down the edges of a jagged stone, the change was so slow that the final destruction arrived before she even realized the shape had altered. First, it was a high-profile council dinner he abruptly canceled without an explanation. When she gently questioned him about it later, he merely dismissed her with a distracted, irritated wave of his hand, signaling that her curiosity was an inconvenience to his day. Then, it was an expert diplomatic strategy she offered during a morning briefing, which he aggressively cut off and never revisited. The quiet library evenings became rare, then non-existent, stopping entirely without a word or a formal goodbye. Somewhere around the 8th month of his emotional withdrawal, deep in the freezing depths of winter, Nyx realized with a chilling certainty that he had not asked her, "What does the day need?" in a very long time. Sereni had arrived 9 months ago, traveling as a high-ranking delegate from the visiting Shadowfang delegation. At first, she found political reasons to extend her stay by a week, then a month, and then, through calculated maneuvering, she simply never left. Serene possessed a highly specific, weaponized warmth that acted like a drug on proud leaders. She knew exactly how to make an arrogant alpha feel like the absolute center of the universe. It was the kind of artificial understanding that allowed a man to feel worshipped without ever having to reflect on his own flaws. Kaylin responded to that toxic flattery exactly the way powerful, prideful men do when they have spent years convincing themselves that their fated mate's unshakable loyalty is a basic duty rather than a profound act of devotion. He mistook Nyx's infinite capacity to quietly bear burdens as absolute proof that the labor wasn't hurting her. He wasn't overtly cruel to her, cruelty would have been far easier to fight. He was simply somewhere else, completely enthralled by a shinier, easier presence that demanded nothing of his character. The tipping point arrived during the mid-year Interpack Summit, surrounded by visiting Alpha allies from 3 foreign territories. Kalen stood proudly at the head of the receiving line, grandly introducing his inner court, his legendary warrior captains, and his trusted elders. "And this is Sereni, an absolutely magnificent addition to our royal court," Kalen announced to the foreign dignitaries, his eyes shining with open admiration. "I honestly do not know how our kingdom managed to function before her arrival." He then walked right past Nyx without pausing. He didn't look at her with hostility or deliberate malice. He simply bypassed her existence entirely, the exact way a man ignores a common window pane when he is focused entirely on the view outside. A visiting alpha from the Iron Claw pack stopped dead in his tracks. He bypassed Kalen's outstretched hand, stepping forward to bow respectfully before Nyx. "I have been analyzing your Moon Ridge territorial proposal with great fascination, my Luna," the visiting alpha said. His voice filled with genuine reverence. "The specific economic clause structures you designed are unlike any diplomatic framework I have seen in decades." "Exceptional work." "Thank you, Alpha," Nyx replied softly, forcing a polite, elegant smile onto her face. She had become a master at smiling through ruin. But deep inside her soul, something that had been infinitely patient for 5 agonizing years finally reached its absolute end. That night, locked alone inside her dark quarters, Nyx sat at her desk and pulled open a hidden drawer she hadn't touched in years. Resting flat between 2 brittle pieces of parchment was a single, dried moonflower from the night of their fated bonding ceremony. It was 5 years old now, dried to a paper-thin, translucent ghost of its former self, yet it still held its perfect shape, its edges still shimmering with a faint, ghostly silver white. She held the fragile flower up to the dying flame of her candle, staring at it for a very long time. She was desperately searching for the ghost of the 19-year-old prince who had stood by the stone basin, the boy whose face had completely cracked open with honest, terrifying love, the boy who used to look into her blind eyes and ask what the day needed. She had spent years searching for that man inside the cold, arrogant ruler Kalen had become. She had rationalized every returned council nod, every dismissive glance, and every suffocating silence, praying that a fraction of their original love was still alive. Nyx slowly closed the drawer and blew out the candle. In the pitch blackness of her room, for the first time in 5 years, she finally forced herself to confront the terrifying question she had been running from. What if I haven't been looking at the wrong man? What if I am looking in the exact right direction, but the man I loved simply no longer exists? The silent darkness offered no comfort. She sat alone with the crushing weight of that realization until the embers in the hearth turned to ash. Then she went to sleep. She had 17 critical tasks to complete in the morning. She always did. The 30-page trade treaty Nyx had built from scratch was a masterpiece of legal architecture. She had drafted 4 separate versions, each one tighter and more flawless than the last. Every single sentence was written with the extreme precision of a strategist who understands that the specific words chosen in a treaty today dictate what bloody wars your grandchildren will be fighting 10 years from now. She had placed the completed manuscript safely on the High Council table the evening before the summit, anchoring it down with a heavy stone weight before retiring to her quarters for a brief rest. She returned at dawn to add a single economic notation she had formulated on her walk. The document was gone. The High Council meeting proceeded anyway. Kalen stood proudly at the head of the table and delivered a sweeping, highly generalized verbal outline. He offered 3 broad, empty sentences in place of 30 pages of meticulous administrative architecture. The elders nodded in blind agreement. The kingdom moved forward. No one questioned the absence of a written framework. No one noticed that the core foundation of the treaty was completely missing. Throughout the entire briefing, Nyx said absolutely nothing. She calmly raised her hand to ask a single, highly technical question regarding implementation timelines, took meticulous notes, and kept her facial expression perfectly composed. The moment the chamber cleared, she went searching. She found the charred, black remains of her 3 days of labor stuffed carelessly into the iron fireplace grate of the council anteroom. It wasn't fully consumed by the flames. It was Alpha King, a romantic woman. Enough of her distinct, elegant handwriting and her custom clause numbering system remained legible to leave absolute certainty as to what it was. Serene was already standing inside the quiet anteroom, browsing the bookshelves with a completely natural posture. The casual stance of a predator who had meticulously prepared a flawless alibi for being in the room. The moment she noticed Nyx, her radiant warmth returned instantly. Her beautiful head tilted in a perfectly practiced gesture of soft, horrified apology. "Oh, Nyx, those documents on the table were yours?" Serene gasped, her voice dripping with gentle, breathless sorrow. "I am so incredibly sorry. I was clearing away a massive stack of obsolete, outdated ledgers, and I must have gathered them into the burn pile by mistake. I am still trying so hard to learn the complex administrative flow of this palace." Her vocal performance was flawless. Every single word was precisely modulated to convey innocent warmth. But behind that mask, her eyes remained dead, calculating, and chillingly still. She wasn't afraid of being caught. She wasn't guilty. She was entirely, calmly triumphant. Nyx stood perfectly still, letting her blind gaze rest directly on Serene for a long, suffocating moment. In that silence, she saw the artificial warmth and the predatory stillness align perfectly. She finally understood that they weren't contradictions at all. They were the true nature of the woman before her, and she had spent months choosing to believe the lie. "Of course," Nyx replied, her voice smooth and entirely conversational. "These things happen." She turned and walked back to her office. She sat down at her desk, dipped her quill in ink, and rewrote all 30 pages of the complex treaty entirely from memory in less than 4 hours. She filed it through the palace's standard administrative routing system. She forced herself to pretend it was a careless mistake. She almost managed to make herself believe it. 3 days later, Nyx was navigating a deserted, shadowy back corridor near the lower archives when she heard Serene's voice echoing from around the corner. It was not the melodic, warm voice she used in the grand halls or the council chambers. This voice was low, sharp, and cold, the chilling register of a commander delivering calculated execution orders. Serene was speaking directly to Valor, the young palace scribe, and the precise instructions she was feeding him were terrifying. She was wrapping a systemic administrative assassination in the mundane language of daily paperwork. Route every single filed report from Nix's office through the extended secondary review process, Serene commanded coldly. They use the current winter administrative backlog as your official justification. Keep the language completely procedural. No one in the High Council ever questions procedural language. Nix froze against the stone wall, standing completely motionless for 3 agonizing seconds. It was long enough to hear the sinister architecture of the plot. It was long enough to realize that this wasn't an impromptu act of jealousy. Serene had been systematically building a web over months, using the palace's own bureaucracy to slowly erase Nix's authority and visibility until she vanished from the kingdom entirely, leaving no fingerprints behind. As Nix took a step forward, Serene turned and spotted her. The artificial warmth snapped back onto her face like a theater curtain dropping on a stage. "Nix, you startled me," Serene laughed softly, pressing a hand over her heart. "I was just sorting through a confusing filing error with young Valor here." Valor's posture was pathetic. He stood hunched over, his shoulders drawn inward, his eyes glued to the floorboards as he trembled. "Of course," Nix said, her voice a mask of absolute calm. "Good evening, Serene." She walked directly to her office, locked the heavy oak door behind her, and sat down in the pitch blackness. "I see it now," she thought, the realization settling into her bones with absolute, crystal clarity. "I see the whole shape of it." Then came the harder, more devastating realization, the shadow that always follows the light. "I have seen pieces of this treachery for months. I chose to see them as accidents because the truth was too painful to bear. I chose the easier lie." She sat alone with that crushing truth for hours as her candle burned down to nothing. The Grand Interpack Summit was held weeks later on strictly neutral ground, a massive stone council hall erected in the wild. The open territories where 3 volatile pack borders converged. It was chosen specifically because no single Alpha King could claim dominance over the space. Nix had spent 2 entire weeks meticulously preparing the Blood Moon's defensive strategy regarding a highly contentious border realignment. As always, she had been thorough. As always, she had anticipated every single counterargument their rivals could possibly launch. She stood proudly at the grand presentation table, her fingers resting lightly on her detailed maps, and began to present her framework to the assembly. She had been speaking for roughly 4 minutes, flawlessly constructing a compromise that would perfectly satisfy all 3 rival packs. When Kalen's heavy hand suddenly cut through the air. Nix tends to overcomplicate incredibly straightforward warrior matters, Kalen interrupted with a light, dismissive chuckle. His tone was dripping with the patronizing ease of a man making a joke about a foolish child. He smiled charmingly at the foreign delegates around the table. "Let me summarize the reality of the border for you in simple terms." 5 powerful foreign delegations sat in total silence. These were representatives from kingdoms that had deeply respected the Blood Moon's brilliant diplomatic positions for half a decade. A reputation Nix had single-handedly built, maintained and fiercely protected through the most dangerous political crises in modern history. Several of the foreign alphas looked down at the table, shifting uncomfortably. One older commander straightened up in his chair, his face darkening with the intense discomfort of a man witnessing a shameful act of disrespect he was never meant to see. But across the wide, tense room, Alpha King Zirian of Ravencrest did not look down at the table. Zirian stared directly at Kaelin for one cold, calculated second, his jaw tightening into a lethal line of pure disgust. Then he turned his powerful gaze entirely onto Nyx. His look was direct, unhurried, and completely devoid of political performance. When he spoke, his deep, resonant voice cut through the chamber like thunder, requiring no effort to completely silence the room. "I would like to hear the remainder of her presentation," Zarian commanded, his eyes locked onto Nyx with absolute reverence. The woman was building toward an incredibly sound economic foundation. The entire chamber instantly recalibrated. The dismissive atmosphere Kaelin had tried to manufacture vanished. The visiting delegates sat up straight, adjusting their postures. Nyx did not miss a beat. She finished her presentation with flawless precision. Her resolution was formally and unanimously accepted by the council before the session was even closed. After the grand hall emptied, Nyx remained at her table, quietly organizing her papers into her leather satchel. She heard a heavy, deliberate stride approaching. Zarian moved with the absolute authority of a true king, a man who never required space to be cleared for him because his very presence commanded it. He stopped a respectful, comfortable distance from her table, waiting patiently until she tilted her head up to face him. He stopped a respectful, comfortable distance from her table, waiting patiently until she tilted her head up to face him. "You should not be accustomed to what just occurred in this room, my Luna," Zirian said directly. There was no artificial warmth in his voice. There was no soft, coddling manipulation meant to manage her fragile emotions. It was a raw, honest observation, delivered straight from one sovereign ruler to another. And for the first time in 5 years, Nyx felt truly seen. The grand hall emptied. Nyx remained at her table, quietly organizing her papers into her leather satchel. She heard a heavy, deliberate stride approaching. Zirian moved with the absolute authority of a true king, a man who never required space to be cleared for him because his very presence commanded it. He stopped a respectful, comfortable distance from her table, waiting patiently until she tilted her head up to face him. "You should not be accustomed to what just occurred in this room, my Luna," Zirian said directly. There was no artificial warmth in his voice. There was no soft, coddling manipulation meant to manage her fragile emotions. It was a raw, honest observation, delivered straight from one sovereign ruler to another. And for the first time in 5 years, Nyx felt truly seen. "I am," she said, her voice dropping into the quiet space between them. Because she was. Because she had been enduring the cold weight of invisibility for longer than she cared to remember. Carrying a pack that only saw her usefulness and never her soul. Zirian did not look away, his dark eyes steady under the flickering iron torches. "You should not be." 4 words. They were spoken without pity, level and absolute, yet they carried more weight than any declaration she had heard in months. They were a quiet judgment against the kingdom that had taken everything from her while offering nothing in return. He leaned forward slightly, resting a leather-gloved hand on the edge of the dark oak table. He told her there was an open position at Ravencrest, a seat at his own high table for a strategic advisor. It was exactly the kind of governance she had mastered in the shadows, but this time the credit would belong solely to her. The authority would be hers to wield openly. "No conditions," he murmured, his deep baritone cutting through the chill of the hall. "No timeline. You may cross the border when you are ready, if you are ever ready. And if you choose never to come, let this conversation remain what it is, a truth spoken to a woman who has earned the right to hear it." Nyx did not give him an answer. Her fingers remained steady as she buckled her satchel, inclining her head in a silent gesture of farewell. "Good night, Your Majesty," she whispered, walking past him into the gathering frost outside. But the words followed her. She could not have cast them from her mind even if she had possessed the will to try. Not the offer of sanctuary, but the 4 words that had preceded it. "You should not be." They became a rhythmic chant in her mind during the long, solitary journey back to her quarters, turning over and over in the darkness, like a smooth stone in a freezing river. By the time she crossed the iron-wrought thresholds of the Blood Moon territory, her path remained unmapped. Yet somewhere deep within her, past the blindness and the quiet obedience, a tectonic shift had occurred. It was the silent, imperceptible movement of Earth before a mountain collapses. The Blood Moon Winter Festival was the most sacred gathering in the Pack's calendar, an ancient ceremony where every bloodline was required to bear witness under the light of the great hearths. Warriors clad in heavy furs and iron plate lined the upper tiers of the stone theater. Children huddled at the feet of the elders, their small heads growing heavy against old knees before the candles had burned down to their midpoints. The air inside the vaulted stone chamber was thick with the scent of burning pine resin, dry cedar, and the sharp silver-white fragrance of crushed moonflowers. Rows of those very blossoms bordered the central dais and the long ceremonial tables, blooms that Nyx had harvested and arranged with her own hands 3 days prior, just as she had done every winter for half a decade. She took her place at the lower end of the high table, her posture straight and flawless. Out of ancient habit, she had brought a few remaining pieces of administrative work hidden within her robes. A trade ledger intended for Elder Kyrox once the speeches concluded. A minor patrol report concerning the southern thickets, ordinary, tedious logistics that she carried the way a soldier carries a lucky charm. She was not seeking to work during the feast. She simply did not know how to exist without being purposeful. Even in a room vibrating with music and wine, her mind remained a fortress of order. She sat in her customary silence, entirely unaware that the foundations of her life were about to break. The ceremony commenced with the traditional rites. The Elder Council delivered the old verses, their voices echoing off the frost-rimed pillars. Warrior captains stepped forward, drawing their short swords to strike their shields in renewed vows of loyalty. Families exchanged the braided silver threads that bound their houses together in seasonal alliances. The atmosphere was dense with warmth, laughter, and the shared comfort of an ancient pack. It was exactly the harmony Nyx had spent 5 years preserving through sleepless nights and unseen labor, ensuring the kingdom ran flawlessly, so its ruler never had to look down at the dirt. Then Prince Kalen stood. He was magnificent in his arrogance, his broad shoulders draped in a heavy mantle of black wolfskin, his golden crown gleaming beneath the iron chandeliers. He looked every bit the absolute ruler he had been bred to be, commanding the room by the mere grace of his stature. When he spoke, his voice filled the rafters, rich and absolute. He spoke at length about the unyielding strength of the Blood Moon lineage, about the necessity of absolute perfection in leadership, and the sacred obligation of an alpha to cast aside any weakness that might taint the pack's future ascension. Nyx watched him with her sightless, milky eyes, her head tilted slightly toward the sound of his boots. She watched the slight tension in his jaw, the rhythm of his breathing, the long, deliberate pauses he employed before delivering a decree. Without ever intending to, she had mapped this man's entire existence. 5 years of studying his moods, his silences, and his rages. She knew him the way a traveler knows a dangerous mountain pass after surviving it 1,000 times in the dark. She was listening intently when his voice shifted, uttering her name across the crowded hall. The sentence that followed cut through the music like an iron blade. With formal authority and the backing of the Elder Council, Prince Kalen was severing their fated mate bond. He declared her blind state an unforgivable blemish on the royal line, an omen of weakness that could no longer be tolerated. His future, his true chosen Luna, who would bear the next generation of apex predators, was Serene. The words struck her chest in measured succession, heavy and cold, like lead weights dropped into a frozen well. She processed the statement once, and the reality did not bend. She processed it a second time, and the truth remained absolute. She did not gasp. She did not cry out. Her features remained as still as carved marble. From the side of the hall, Serene stepped into the torchlight, her movements graceful and fluid. Her face wore an expression of delicate, beautiful astonishment, the precise, the practiced surprise of a woman who had spent months engineering the very moment she was performing. Around the tables, the reaction was instantaneous. The warriors struck their fists against the oak tables in a deafening roar of approval. The Elder Council nodded their silver heads in solemn agreement. 300 wolves, the very people who had lined up outside Nyx's office at dawn with grievances. The families who survived winters on her grain calculations. The soldiers who lived because of her medical distribution. Joined their voices in a chorus of celebration for the new union. Nyx looked down at the dark grain of the wood beneath her hands. Her fingers brushed the leather binding of the trade ledger she had meant to give Elder Kyrax. She touched the corner of the patrol roster. They were small, ordinary fragments of a life spent entirely in service to others. They were the physical manifestation of a devotion that had never required a title to give everything it possessed. And in 5 years, not a single soul in that hall had ever thought to call that devotion by its true name. Love. Slowly, she raised her left arm. The silver mate cuff, forged from heavy mountain silver and etched with the runes of the moon goddess, had lived upon her wrist for 3 years, since the night their souls had supposedly locked. She had never removed it. In moments of deep exhaustion or bitter isolation, her fingers would automatically trace the cold metal, using it as an anchor against the storm. She reached for it now, her movements devoid of haste. Her thumb found the hidden release mechanism. With a soft, metallic click, the cuff unclasped, She placed the silver band onto the stone table beside her platter. The sound of the metal meeting the stone was minuscule, a mere whisper that should have been completely drowned out by the roaring cheers of 300 celebrating wolves. Yet, it was not lost on everyone. Across the wide floor, Elder Kyrox was staring directly at her. When Nyx turned her face toward him, she caught an expression on the old warrior's face that she had never seen before. The profound, helpless sorrow of a man watching a catastrophe he had foreseen, but lacked the power to prevent. She held the elder's gaze for one heartbeat, only one. Then she gathered her papers. She stood up from her chair, stacking the ledgers and the patrol notes into a perfect uniform pile. She aligned the edges with the exact precision she brought to every task she performed for the pack. Order, she had always believed, was the final sanctuary of dignity. Even as her world turned to ash, she refused to lose herself to the chaos. With her shoulders squared and her spine straight, she walked away from the high table toward the massive ceremonial doors. As her boots struck the center aisle, a sudden hush began to ripple through the crowd. 300 pairs of eyes turned to watch the blind Omega walk down the long hall alone. She did not look back. She did not falter. Pushing the heavy, iron-reinforced doors open, she stepped through into the freezing night, and the great barriers groaned shut behind her. The corridor outside was empty and silent as a tomb. Nyx took 3 paces, then stopped. She pressed her palm flat against the frost-covered stone wall, closing her eyes as the cold bit into her skin. She forced herself to breathe. 1, 2, 3. They were the deep, measured breaths she had taught young scouts to use when overcoming panic on the battlefield. For a handful of agonizing seconds, the sheer weight of the betrayal threatened to crush her ribs. But she refused to let the pain claim a full minute of her life. She opened her eyes, lifted her hand from the wall, and continued walking. She did not run. She had never run from anything in her existence. She reached the eastern boundary of the Blood Moon territory shortly before midnight, her boots crunching softly over the frozen pine needles. An hour later, she crossed the outer border landmarks into the neutral wilderness. Deep within the ancient forest, where the giant pines blocked out the wind and the distant sounds of the festival had entirely dissolved, she stopped. With a low, shuddering breath, she shifted. A magnificent wolf, its coat the color of pale, luminescent gold, materialized on the dark forest floor. Then she ran. She did not run out of cowardice or despair, though the sorrow within her was vast enough to drown a kingdom. She did not run out of simple fury, though a dark, ancient anger was beginning to stir in the deepest recesses of her blood. She ran because her physical body had been a cage of restraint for 5 long years, carrying every burden, every insult, and every unearned responsibility without ever being permitted to break. Now, there was nothing left to hold up. The structure had collapsed, and the sheer explosive energy of her freedom needed an outlet. She ran until the scent of Blood Moon's pine resin and ceremonial moonflowers was washed from her fur by the mountain wind. She ran until the distant glow of Kyelen's watchtowers was swallowed by the black horizon. She ran until there was nothing left in the world except the rhythmic thud of her paws against the earth, the freezing air in her lungs, and the vast, beautiful silence of a night that belonged to no master. She ran until the dawn began to break over the eastern peaks. When the first rays of gold light hit the iron gates of Ravencrest, Nyx walked through them on foot, her satchel of documents slung over her shoulder. She still held them tightly. They were the only thing she owned that possessed any meaning. Within that leather bag lay 3 years of carefully negotiated treaty drafts, her personal journals of medicinal herb formulas, 2 simple tunics, and the unyielding dignity of a woman who refused to appear broken, even in the aftermath of her world's destruction. Varric, Zirion's formidable beta, was already waiting at the inner gatehouse. He was a massive warrior with a scarred jaw and the quiet, efficient movements of a commander who despised wasted effort. He took one look at her frozen garments, the satchel in her hand, and the unbreakable composure of a woman who had survived a devastating night without letting her knees touch the ground. He asked her nothing. He turned and led her down a quiet path toward the Eastern Lodge. The chamber he provided was spacious and clean, constructed from heavy cedar beams that smelled of wood smoke and fresh well water. He left a wooden tray of hot broth and bread on the bench outside her door without knocking. Before he withdrew, he spoke 3 sentences, his voice devoid of theatrical pity. "The room is yours for as long as your shadow falls here, my Luna. The Alpha King will speak with you only when you desire it, and not a moment before. If the night grows too cold, my quarters are at the end of this passage." Then his heavy steps faded down the corridor. Nyx sat on the edge of the clean mattress, listening until the lodge was completely still. She allowed herself exactly 5 minutes of total, motionless silence. She did not use that time to analyze, to plan, or to weep. She was finished with thought for the day. She slept for 11 uninterrupted hours. When she woke, the sunlight streaming through the high windows was the color of liquid amber. She lay still for a moment, orienting herself entirely by the smells of her surroundings: cedar, hearth fire, and clean water. The silence here was different. It was the quiet of a house that required absolutely nothing from her. No one was shouting her name. No ledger was waiting for her signature. The world had turned for a whole day without her hands on the gears. She had forgotten that the universe could move without her labor. When she met Zirion in the stone study later that afternoon, the Alpha King was brief and direct. He did not offer empty platitudes. He did not ask her to recount the humiliation at the festival. Nor did he offer the kind of fragile sympathy that required the victim to comfort the bystander. He simply slid a thick leather folder across the map table between them. "Tell me what is broken," he said. Nyx pulled the folder toward her. Her fingers traced the ink inscriptions for several minutes, her mind absorbing the logistical lines. "There are 3 fatal inefficiencies in your Eastern patrol patterns," she stated clearly. "A loophole exists in the standing treaty with the Moonridge Pack that creates a massive legal liability, one they haven't discovered yet, but will within the year. And your northern medicine depots are facing a severe supply deficit that could be resolved by altering the trade routes through the valley. An alternative your current quartermaster has likely overlooked." Zirion listened, his dark eyes fixed on her face. He gave a single firm nod. "Begin on Monday." Nyx felt the faint ghost of a smile touch her lips. "Today is Monday, Your Majesty." "Then begin now," he replied. The restoration of Nyx did not manifest in a single dramatic transformation. It occurred through the steady accumulation of ordinary days, through the gradual settling of a new reality, and the slow expansion of a life that finally had room to grow without being trimmed back for another's comfort. Varric was a demanding, meticulous commander, but his respect for her intelligence was immediate and absolute. A rare gift from a man who did not offer his regard lightly. When she resolved a border patrol conflict in 20 minutes that his own captains had spent a week debating, the giant beta stared at the revised map for a long moment. "I am grateful fortune brought you to our gates, my Luna," he said quietly before leaving her office. By the third day, the people of Ravencrest knew her name. By the turn of the week, they had stopped treating her like a refugee. She was greeted with deep bows in the stone corridors. Her counsel was sought on matters of trade, and she was invited to sit at tables where no secondary place was carved out for her. She sat at the center because that was where the work was done, and she discovered she did not have to beg for a place to stand. The seat was simply hers, as though the room had always been waiting for her arrival. On the fourth morning, Zanira arrived at the Ravencrest gates. The 20-year-old warrior was carrying her entire life in a single canvas pack, her face bearing the stubborn expression of someone who had made a dangerous choice and possessed absolutely no regrets about it. When Nyx found her at the entrance, Zanira merely shrugged, a fierce light in her eyes. "I could not breathe in a kingdom that watched what the prince did to you and called it justice, my Luna," the girl said simply. Nyx stood perfectly still for a heartbeat. Then she stepped forward and pulled the young warrior into a fierce embrace. From that day on, Zanira became her shadow. She was her student, her helper, and eventually, something that felt remarkably like a younger sister. A living reminder of who Nyx had been before she learned to make herself small to keep an arrogant prince happy. Watching Zanira navigate the halls of Ravencrest was like looking into a mirror of her own youth. The girl possessed a brilliant hunger for knowledge, absorbing tactical information like dry earth absorbing rain. Always returning to Nyx's desk, asking for more difficult assignments. Nyx gave her everything she had, holding nothing back, because she was no longer living in a court where elevating another meant diminishing herself. 3 weeks into her stay, Varric made the mistake of entering the medicine lodge at the wrong hour. The resident healer, a terrifying elder named Olara Frostfang, who possessed iron-gray hair and a voice like an executioner's axe, had been hunting the beta for weeks over a neglected shoulder wound. Varric had been ignoring a severe muscle tear with the specific, idiotic pride of powerful alphas who believe their bodies are immune to physical limitations. Nyx was sorting through a shipment of dried roots when Olara trapped the massive beta in the doorway. The argument that followed? Varric, attempting to maintain his formal kingly dignity, while Olara systematically dismantled his excuses with brutal medical facts, was so utterly, beautifully ridiculous that Nyx laughed. It was not the polite, guarded chuckle she had used for 5 years at Prince Kaelin's court to keep from making his guests uncomfortable. It was a real laugh, deep and unrestrained, originating from somewhere profound within her chest. It filled her entire face, shaking her shoulders until she had to lean against the cedar doorframe to keep her balance. Olara watched her with immense smugness, while Varric endured the amusement with the look of a warrior accepting his execution. From the dark corner of the room, where he had been quietly observing an inventory report, Zirion watched her. He did not speak. He did not disrupt the moment with a grand gesture. He simply stood in the shadows, his eyes locked onto her face as she laughed, filing the image away into a private, sacred place within his mind. The sight of her completely unguarded, radiating a pure, brilliant joy, mattered to him more than he was prepared to admit to his council. That evening, Nyx took her place at the center of the grand dining hall. She spoke for 10 uninterrupted minutes on a new agricultural project, and not a single elder looked down at their plate. No one tried to steer the conversation away. No one took her ideas and presented them as their own. Instead, a senior captain built upon her premise. An elder asked her a respectful follow-up question. A third warrior laughed at a dry remark she made regarding a border scout, and the amusement rippled across the high table naturally. Warm and genuine, the way laughter sounds in a house where everyone is truly valued. Nyx looked down at her hands and realized she had been speaking simply as herself for the first time in memory. She was not delivering a formal report. She was not defending her existence. She was not trying to be useful. She was simply living. On her 4th week at Ravencrest, she discovered a high, rocky ledge that overlooked the valley. It was a flat shelf of gray stone, situated at the crest of the ridge, offering a vast, unobstructed view of the lodges below. Where the hearth fires were beginning to twinkle through the purple dusk like fallen stars. She stood there in the biting wind, filling her lungs with the clean mountain air. She heard footsteps behind her, steady, deliberate, and entirely unbothered by any need to hide their approach. Zirion stopped beside her, leaving a comfortable distance between them. He was close enough that his immense warmth cut through the winter chill, yet far enough that she felt no pressure from his shadow. He offered no explanation for his presence. He didn't ask if she desired solitude. He merely stood at her side, his gaze fixed on the lights below. After a long silence, his deep voice broke the quiet. "How does the air taste here, my Luna?" Nyx remained silent for a long time, her sightless eyes turned toward the horizon. "Like freedom," she whispered. "I had forgotten that the world was this large." Zirion stared out into the dark valley. "Good," he said simply. There were no hidden demands in his tone, no heavy expectations. They watched the fires of the pack town burn together until the final remnants of purple light disappeared from the western sky. She did not know then that this rocky ridge would become their sanctuary, the place where the most profound truths of their lives would be spoken in the months to come. She only knew that she did not want to step away from his side. The intelligence reports began crossing the border 3 weeks after her departure. Varric brought the documents to her office without a word, understanding that some news required no commentary to convey its gravity. He placed the leather folder on her desk and softly closed the door. Nyx opened the ledger and traced the reports with the detached, clinical focus of an architect examining a collapsed building she no longer owned. The Moon Ridge Trade Alliance had completely disintegrated. The 30-page master agreement she had spent 4 days drafting, the one Kaelin had thrown into the hearth fire, had never been replicated. Following her departure, with Serene attempting to manage the administrative transition, The Blood Moon Pack had entered the secondary negotiations using nothing but Kalen's arrogant 3-sentence verbal summary. The meeting had dissolved within 40 minutes. By the following dawn, the Moon Ridge leaders had broken off all communication with Kalen and signed a direct distribution treaty with the Ironclaw Pack, stripping the Blood Moon Kingdom of a trade alliance they had dominated for nearly a decade. Furthermore, a minor border skirmish in the Southern Valley had escalated into a full territorial conflict. The contingency plan Nyx had already completed and archived to prevent this exact crisis had never been presented to the Council. It remained buried beneath a mountain of unorganized paperwork in the Central Archives. And because no one but Nyx knew its location, it was left to rot. 3 ancient ally packs had quietly severed their military ties with the prince. They didn't send angry declarations. They simply withdrew their warriors from joint outposts, choosing to distance themselves from a crown that was visibly losing its grip on governance. The administrative failures were small when viewed individually: late letters, lost messages, misfiled borders, but their accumulation was catastrophic. Nyx closed the folder with a soft sigh. Elder Kyrox had warned him, she thought, without a single shred of malice. The old man had told her months ago, during a quiet moment in the courtyard, that her labor was not a partnership. He told her that her management of the Blood Moon Pack was so seamless, so invisible, that the wolves had forgotten where her genius ended and the structure of the kingdom began. He warned her that if she ever withdrew her hand, the result wouldn't be a minor inconvenience. It would be a total collapse. She had heard his words then, but she had refused to act on them. To leave would have required her to choose her own soul over her duty. And she had not yet learned that choosing oneself was an act of survival, not betrayal. She understood it now. The final blow to the prince's court came from within. Valor, the young palace scribe, came forward without an investigation or a trial. He walked into the High Council chambers 3 weeks after the Winter Festival, carrying a massive pile of handwritten confessions. His fingers trembling, but his writing entirely legible. He was a young man who had carried a treacherous secret for too long, and the weight of it was tearing him apart. His testimony detailed 8 months of deliberate, systematic administrative sabotage orchestrated by Serenay. He revealed how Nyx's strategic reports had been intentionally delayed through artificial reviews. He provided proof that the letters between Nyx and foreign alphas had been intercepted and rewritten, timed to arrive only after critical decisions had already been finalized. It was a cold, surgical campaign designed to make Nyx appear negligent and incompetent at the exact moments her leadership mattered most. Serene had understood that power could be stolen through ink and paper just as easily as through poison, leaving no trace of her crimes behind. Prince Kalen initiated a formal inquiry the morning after the scribe's confession. Now, late into the midnight hours, the Alpha Prince sat alone in his darkened chamber, surrounded by hundreds of old ledgers and letters. The hearth fire had died down to gray ash, but he didn't move to rebuild it. He stared at the documents with the grim, hollow expression of a man who had finally run out of lies to tell himself. He saw the patterns clearly now. He saw the empty spaces where Nyx's brilliant mind should have guided him, spaces he had allowed Serene to fill with sweet words and false flattery. He saw the deliberate delays, the hidden processing errors, the calculated isolation of his true mate. He found the charred fragments of her 30-page treaty in the ash of the council fireplace. He remembered seeing the burnt parchment weeks ago and dismissing it as old waste. Because he had become an expert at ignoring any truth that required him to humble his pride. Slowly, his trembling hand reached into his desk drawer. He pulled out the silver mate cuff Nyx had left on the stone table. He had kept it wrapped in silk, unable to look at it, yet unable to throw it away. He turned the cold silver over in his palms, the runes mocking his emptiness in the dark. The heavy brass doors of the Ravencrest Grand Council Chamber ground open, cutting through the low hum of voices inside. Nyx entered at the side of Alpha King Zirian, her blind eyes fixed forward, her posture radiating an immutable serenity. She did not take a seat at the periphery, nor did she relegate herself to the corners where the scribes and assistants huddled over inkwells. Instead, she glided directly to the massive oak table, pulling out the heavy, high-backed chair immediately to Zirian's right. Beside her, the silver-haired elder Kyrox gave a slow, deliberate nod of greeting, his ancient eyes shining with profound respect. Across the table sat the visiting delegates from 5 vast wolf territories, their murmurs dying down into a sharp, expectant silence. For months, an intricate trade and border dispute had gridlocked the northern packs, draining resources and pushing them to the brink of civil war. Kaelin, the arrogant alpha prince of the Blood Moon Pack, had tried to claim the framework for its resolution as his own engineering. But the scribes had fumbled the implementation. Now, Nyx reached out, her fingertips tracing the embossed leather of the final treaty document with effortless grace. When she spoke, her voice lacked any dramatic strain, yet its crisp, melodic authority commanded the entire room. She broke down the logistics, the tariff structures, and the ancestral territorial lines in less than 3 minutes, offering a flawless resolution that left the rival warlords speechless. Zirian looked at her, his stoic features softening into an open display of admiration, unthreatened and utterly captivated by her brilliant mind. The heavy doors groaned once more, and Kaelin stepped into the chamber, flanked by his guards and the beautifully calculating Serenay. The arrogant prince carried himself with his usual demanding bearing, expecting the room to bend to his presence. But as he marched toward his designated seat, his gaze locked onto the woman sitting at the right hand of the Ravencrest Alpha. He froze. A visible tremor shattered his commanding stride for a fraction of a second. Nyx, sensing his presence through the shifting air and the heavy scent of pine and ozone, turned her face toward him. Her sightless eyes held his for 3 agonizing seconds, completely unhurried, perfectly level, devoid of any fear or lingering attachment. Kaelin's jaw tightened as he forced himself to break the gaze, recovering his posture and sinking into his chair with a cold, a hollow weight settling into his chest. As the formal session concluded, the delegates began to disperse, the heavy scrape of chairs echoing through the stone hall. Kaelin did not wait. He intercepted Nyx before she could gather her records, stepping into her path with a desperate familiarity that no longer belonged to him. Nyx, he spoke, his voice strained beneath a thin veneer of authority. You vanished from the palace without a proper explanation. You abandoned your sacred duties to the Blood Moon lineage. I filed my formal resignation through the proper clerical channels, Prince Kaelin, Nyx replied, her pleasant precision striking him like ice. Your beta confirmed receipt the morning after the winter ceremony. My position had already been filled by Sereni before I walked away from it. Kalen shifted his stance, his voice rising as he tried to invoke the ancient laws of the Pax. We are bound by history, by the blood of the ancestors. A true mate does not cast aside her obligations for personal grievances. Come home, Nyx. Nyx stood quietly, letting the word hang in the air. Home, she murmured softly. This is my home. I have built a sanctuary here. I chose it. She looked through him, her expression entirely free of hostility or heat. I genuinely hope the Blood Moon Pack finds its footing, Kalen, but my place is here. Sereni stepped forward then, her face contorted with a bright, controlled anger that she could no longer conceal beneath her practiced warmth. The administrative systems she had tried to usurp were collapsing, and Valor's recent confession regarding misfiled reports had exposed her manipulations. You are dressing your own failure in dignity, Sereni hissed, her voice echoing off the stone walls. You left because you were an Omega, too weak to hold the position that was fated to you. Nyx turned her face fully toward Serenai. The room went dead silent. When Nyx spoke, her voice was not raised, but it cut through the room with the absolute exactness of a blade. She systematically named every infraction. She detailed the exact date Serene had ordered the 30-page border treaty burned in the palace courtyard. She listed the calculated correspondence delays, the exact mountain routes manipulated to isolate the border patrols, and the precise instructions given to Valor in the back corridors of the palace to obscure the administrative errors. Every piece of the deception was laid bare before the entire council. I know all of it, Nyx concluded calmly, and I want you to understand something. I am no longer angry. Anger requires the thing to still matter to me, and you do not. Flustered and humiliated, Serene lunged forward blindly. Before she could make contact, Nyx's hand came up with effortless control. Without an ounce of aggression, she intercepted Serene's movement, holding her firmly by the wrist for one heartbeat before releasing her and stepping back. She had no need for rage to command absolute power. Zirian stepped into the space beside Nyx, his towering frame casting a long shadow across the table as he stared down the Blood Moon Prince. He did not raise his voice. You had her, Kalen, Zirian said, the words heavy and absolute. Every single day, she managed your kingdom, while you looked past her. She stands here because she chose to be here, and that choice is the only verdict that matters. Kalen stood paralyzed, unable to find a single word to fill the silence. He was left with the clearest, most devastating view of exactly what his arrogance had undone. Later that evening, the firelight in Zirian's private quarters burned warm and steady. Before Nyx could even raise her hand to knock, the heavy wooden door swung open. Zirian stood there, already waiting, always present in the ways that truly mattered. They sat by the hearth, the scent of cedar wrapping around them, and Nyx spoke freely. She confessed that the confrontation in the council chamber had not been her closure. Her closure had come the night she left her silver mate cuff on the stone table, running through the frozen forest until the weight of 5 years of neglect finally lifted from her chest. What happened today was simply confirmation, Nyx whispered, reaching up to cup Zirian's face in both hands. She had studied him from every angle, without illusion or performance, and she knew the truth of what she felt. "I love you, Zirian." A deep, private warmth broke across the Alpha King's stoic face. "I have been loving you," he murmured, leaning into her touch, "since before I had any right to." He kissed her then, a slow, deliberate promise. When he pulled back, his forehead rested against hers. "My Luna," he breathed. Below the window, the lights of Ravencrest burned bright. In the grand hall, the mid-year pack gathering was underway, filled with the aroma of roasted grain and sweet pastries. Young Zanira Wolfheart stood confidently at the front of the elders, delivering her first independent patrol briefing without looking at her notes once, earning a rare, sincere nod of approval from Elder Kyrox. The peace was short-lived. As the full moon reached its zenith, a terrifying spiritual shift rippled through the territories. The sky turned an ominous, bruised violet, and a profound, agonizing weight crushed the souls of every member of the Blood Moon Pack. The curse had manifested. Nyx's tears of sorrow upon her rejection had triggered the ultimate judgment of the Moon Goddess. Across the eastern border, Kaelin's warriors collapsed to their knees, screaming as their inner wolves were violently torn away, leaving them entirely human, stripped of their power on the eve of a brutal territorial invasion. Driven by absolute desperation, Kaelin abandoned his pride. He crawled, broken and bleeding, into the forgotten lands of the Sleeping Valley, where Nyx now walked. He found her standing on the frosty ridge overlooking the valley, her silver hair catching the celestial glow of the full moon. "Forgive me, Your Majesty," Kaelin wept, throwing himself prostrate onto the frozen earth, his hands clutching at the hem of her cloak. "Forgive my pack. We are entirely defenseless." Nyx did not turn around immediately. She let the cold wind carry his desperate pleas into the dark. Finally, she turned, her sightless eyes reflecting the blinding light of the cosmos as the full power of the deity radiated from her form. She stepped closer, her hand moving with agonizing slowness to lightly touch his matted hair. "Your arrogance was the price that had to be paid, my Alpha," she whispered, her voice carrying the terrifying weight of divine finality. Zirian stepped to her side, his hand finding hers in the dark, tightening with protective certainty. Nyx leaned into his shoulder, looking down at the thriving lights of Ravencrest. She had walked through the dark forest, her head held high and her dignity intact, until she found a home that recognized her worth. The door to a true destiny never opens until you stop leaning against the one that closed behind you.